Thursday of last week, the U.S. Supreme Court sent a procedurally complicated Title 42 lawsuit back to the D.C. Circuit with instructions to dismiss the case as moot, mostly because the official COVID state of emergency is now over. It was a simple one-line order issued by the Supreme Court and was deemed to be legally uncontroversial. But thankfully, that's not the whole story, folks. Justice Neil Gorsuch decided to add some thoughts of his own to the one-sentence order in an 8-page statement starting immediately below the order itself. Gorsuch's statement was a full-throttle rebuttal of U.S. governmental overreach at every level. I put a link in the notes section. I would strongly encourage you to both read it as well as save it, and most importantly, send it to government officials of all stripes in Canada. Maybe, just maybe, one of these dimwits that you send it to might rediscover the age-old notion of individual freedom resonating from Justice Gorsuch's statement. Justice Gorsuch's statement was a passionate and eloquent critique of government overreach during the pandemic. He set the stage first by accurately describing the tyrannical excesses of out-of-control local and state executives during the pandemic. And I quote, "Since March 2020, we may have experienced the greatest intrusions on civil liberties in the peacetime history of this country. Executive officials across the country issued emergency decrees on a breathtaking scale. Governors and local leaders imposed lockdown orders, forcing people to remain in their homes. They shuttered businesses and schools, public and private. They closed churches, even as they allowed casinos and other favored businesses to carry on. They threatened violators not just with civil penalties, but with criminal sanctions too. They surveilled church parking lots, recorded license plates, and issued notices warning that attendance at even outdoor services satisfying all state and social distancing and hygiene requirements could amount to criminal conduct. They divided cities and neighborhoods into color-coded zones, forced individuals to fight for their freedoms in court on emergency timetables, and then changed their color-coded schemes when defeat in court seemed imminent. Quite the opposite of our Canadian Supreme Court justices, who are only singing the praises of the government and all its actions. According to his critique of the executive branches, local and state so far, the justice also described the federal government's tyrannical contributions, including the mandatory vaccine and even COVID censorship, not much different than Canada, folks. And I quote, "Federal executive officials entered the act too. Not just with emergency immigration decrees, they deployed a public health agency to regulate landlord-tenant relations nationwide. They used a workplace safety agency to issue a vaccination mandate for most working Americans. They threatened to fire non-compliant employees and warned that service members who refused to vaccinate might face dishonorable discharge and confinement. Along the way, it seems federal officials may have pressured social media companies to suppress information about pandemic policies with which they disagreed." Sounds eerily familiar to Canada. Then, to be complete and perfectly fair, he also mentioned the other two branches of government as well, which were guilty not by so much of what they did, but because of what they didn't do. And I quote, "While executive officials issued new emergency decrees at a furious pace, state legislatures and Congress, the bodies normally responsible for adopting our laws, too often fell silent. Courts bound to protect our liberties addressed a few, but hardly all, of the intrusions upon them." Gorsuch concluded it by suggesting that state and federal emergency authority should be reined in, and I quote, "It's hard not to wonder, too, whether state legislatures might profitably re-examine the proper scope of emergency executive powers at the state level. Make no mistake, decisive executive action is sometimes necessary. and appropriate. But if emergency decrees promise to solve more problems, they threaten to generate others. And rule by indefinite emergency edict risks leaving all of us with a shell of a democracy and civil liberties just as hollow. Once again, eerily familiar to Canada. Justice Gorsuch's thoughts are now part of the Supreme Court's official permanent record and will help explain the pandemic to any inquiring minds that want to get at the truth behind the madness of the past 3+ years. Gorsuch seems to have perfectly diagnosed the problem, which is that the US government, not unlike the Canadian government, has gone off the rails, has a distorted view of its purpose and whom it serves. Many Canadians don't know that the US Constitution set up a 3-branch government requiring the 3 branches to have equal powers and authorities. But most US citizens, if asked, would pick the presidency, the executive branch, as the most powerful branch of government, which is certainly the case in Canada, as all power these days seems to reside in the Prime Minister's office, Herr Trudeau's. As Americans have discovered, especially over the past 3 years, federal agency powers like those enjoyed by the CDC, the NHS, the Department of Justice, the IRS, the CIA, and the FBI have wreaked havoc on their lives, but many may not be aware of the fact that these entities are all controlled by the president. Their unchecked growth has led to regulatory capture of ordinary Americans. And dare I say, it's no different in Canada. Bottom line, there's just too much power in the executive branch. Once again, think Trudeau. That's not constitutional. Outsized executive authority was already a problem before the pandemic in the US. Then the pandemic put the problem on steroids. Once again, think Fauci in this case. The corporate media is doing their best to write off Gorsuch as a conservative. They'll work to justify his exhaustive list of authoritarian executive branch excesses as necessary in the emergency. That, while average, everyday Americans keep picking up the pieces of all the shattered lives courtesy of government's so-called mitigation measures. They'll continue to gaslight folks into believing like the virus was worse than the official response by those in charge. They'll continue to tell you and me not to believe our lying eyes. But thankfully, they cannot wish Gorsuch away and his comments away. Why? Well, because first off, he is one of the 9 Supreme Court justices. And secondly, and equally importantly, his words ring true and are genuine, undeniable, and ultimately persuasive because, folks, they are the truth. Anyway, I thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. Please post any comments you have in the comment section. You can also follow me in my Rumble and my Locals account. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so. Get on board. And again, like I said, share your comments, and I will see you next time.